Robert is a young man who believes in working smart, not hard. For years, he's lived a life of luxury without holding a real job. His main job is seducing young, wealthy men from affluent families and making them fall for him. Once he has them hooked, he uses them to get whatever he wants: money, cars, vacations, and more. Seducing these rich men has never been difficult for Robert, as he's both incredibly good-looking and charming, making him irresistible. On top of that, these young men are often sheltered and naive, making them easy to manipulate. Their parents, who usually have their children's futures all mapped out, despise when their sons stray from their plans. When they discover the relationship with Robert, they often offer him money to leave their sons and cut all ties. Robert is always happy to take the money, as he had already planned to leave after getting what he wanted and growing tired of them. After years in the game, Robert decided it was time to retire. He had tripled most of the money he earned from dating wealthy young men through smart investments and could now live comfortably without worrying about finances. He had gotten tired of loveless relationships and was ready to fall in love and settle down. For his 30th birthday, Robert decided to throw a party and invited all his friends, including high school and college friends, through their class groups. He didn't expect many to show up, as he had lost touch with most of them over the years. The one person whose arrival made Robert's heart skip a beat was Jasper. They had been close in high school, almost like a couple, though neither had ever voiced their feelings. They drifted apart when Jasper moved to another country with his family before graduation, and they hadn't spoken since. Robert had once planned to confess his feelings, but never got the chance before Jasper disappeared from his life. Now, standing before him was Jasper, Robert's first love. He thought those feelings had faded, but seeing Jasper again made them come rushing back. Robert couldn't utter a word as Jasper hugged him with a wide smile, saying, "You look the same as I remember." Still silent, Robert stared at him, until Jasper asked, "Are you mad at me?" "Why would I be mad at you?" Robert finally responded. Jasper sighed. "I left without telling you and didn't stay in touch. I was mad at you," Robert admitted. "I thought I'd still be angry whenever I saw you again, but surprisingly, I'm not. I'm just happy to see you." Jasper apologized. "I'm sorry. Everything happened so fast. I didn't get the chance to tell you. I also lost my phone, so I couldn't reach you. I've been trying to find you ever since I came back, and then I bumped into one of our classmates who told me about your birthday party." Robert then said, "I thought I'd never see you again. I'm glad you found me." They smiled at each other, and Robert excused himself to greet his other guests. Later, when the party settled down, Robert and Jasper sat together, talking for the rest of the night. They didn't really have anything in common to talk about except the past and how they had been doing since. There was also a bit of an awkward tension between them, but Robert was just happy his first love was back. After they partied, they exchanged contacts and parted ways. As Robert lay in bed, thinking about rekindling his relationship with Jasper, his phone buzzed. He received texts from 5 of the wealthy men he had dated, all asking to meet at the same place. It felt like they had somehow teamed up to get him or something. He was scared, thinking why this was happening now that he had decided to retire. They even threatened to have him arrested if he didn't show up. The next day he gathered all courage and went to the address they asked to meet at, a private house of one of the guys, which Robert knew very well. When he got there, they all gathered around him, glaring. And they were more than the 5 that texted him to meet. There were 5 more. Robert immediately began begging, promising to return all the money he had taken from them, but they just laughed and went to take a seat, asking him to also sit. Robert took a seat, awaiting what was going to happen next. They wanted him to do something for them. If he agreed, they and the others he had been involved with would forgive him and let him go, but if he refused, they'd ensure he was arrested and locked up for life. Robert knew they could make it happen, even though he hadn't really scammed anyone. All the gifts and money had been given willingly. Still, these men had influence and power. Robert eagerly asked what it was they wanted him to do, and they asked him to seduce and date Sage just like he dated them, and get a sex tape of him. Robert was utterly confused and shocked by the request. Sage was one of the most untouchable men from an affluent family, far more influential than anyone Robert had ever dated. His family's reputation was known by all the other wealthy families and even those in the same business as Robert. Robert had once set his sights on Sage, but after trying to seduce him, he gave up. Sage was nearly impossible to break into. Even getting a chance to meet him was a challenge. He was calm and kind, but always appeared serious and unapproachable. Aside from his close friends, family, and work, Sage showed no interest in anyone or anything else, not even the women his parents introduced as potential marriage partners. Robert asked them why they wanted to do that to Sage. They replied they just hated him. They resented how he acted like he was better than everyone else, and they were tired of their parents constantly comparing them to him. They wanted to prove that Sage wasn't as perfect as everyone believed. Robert, still confused, asked, "How would a sex tape prove that? Having sex at this age is pretty normal." "It's normal, sure," one of them replied, "but not when it's with another man. Same-sex relationships aren't accepted at all in our families. Only a handful of these families are open-minded enough to support their gay kids. Sage and his family will definitely go down when the tape is released, as no one will want to do business with them anymore." Robert raised an eyebrow. "But you're all gay too." They asked him to shut up and just think of how he was going to get close to Sage. They told him not to worry about his own involvement. They'd blur his face in the video, but he had to make sure Sage's face was perfectly clear. Robert felt trapped. He didn't want to go to prison, but hurting Sage like that? He might be a bad person, broken hearts and taken advantage of people for money, but this was different. This was too far. He couldn't bring himself to destroy someone's life like that. He just wanted to leave the place, so he agreed even though he hadn't actually decided to do it and immediately left when he was asked to. As he left, they reminded him that they'd be watching him. There would be no escaping from their plan. Robert returned home, lost in thought, not wanting to do anything but lay down. He didn't know these naive guys, or so he thought, could be this evil. He had been so consumed by his thoughts that he forgot to reply to a text from Jasper asking if they could meet. He had been so consumed by his thoughts that he forgot to reply to a text from Jasper asking if they could meet. Seeing the message again, Robert quickly responded they should, wanting to get his mind off everything. A week passed, and Robert almost forgot about the threatening deal with his ex-boyfriends. He assumed they weren't serious and pushed the whole thing to the back of his mind. That was until one day, the police arrived at his home and arrested him for fraud and extortion. He was detained for a day, unable to contact anyone. While in his cell, his ex-boyfriends called him, making it clear this was just a warning, a way to show him they were being serious. After the call, Robert was released. As he walked home, his mind raced, trying to figure out where to even begin. He had to start doing something to at least get these crazy wealthy kids off his back for a while. He thought of possible ways to get a bit close to Sage and came up with an idea. He decided to try. He asked his ex-boyfriends for information on Sage, anything that could give him a starting point. They gave him all the details they knew, including the fact that Sage adored his dog, Karina, more than anything else. One night, Robert waited near Sage's mansion, watching for him to return from work. When Sage's car finally appeared, Robert clenched his fists, shut his eyes tightly and jumped in front of the car, not enough to get seriously hurt, but just enough to appear unconscious on the ground. Sage's driver panicked, rushing out of the car to check on the person he had hit, while Sage remained in his seat, calm and unbothered. The driver hurried back, informing Sage that they had hit someone, and nervously asked if they should take him to the hospital. Sage responded to take him home instead. Now sitting next to Sage in the car, still pretending to be unconscious, Robert's mind raced, wondering why Sage wasn't taking him to the hospital. When they arrived at Sage's mansion, Sage himself carried Robert inside, taking him to his room and laying him on the bed. As Robert opened his eyes just a little to peek, he saw Sage loosening his necktie and unbuttoning his shirt. Robert quickly shut his eyes again, his thoughts spiraling. Suddenly, Sage's voice broke through his thoughts. "You can get up now. I know you're fine and just pretending." Robert immediately sat up. "Why did you carry me in if you knew I was pretending?" he asked. Sage, now halfway out of his shirt, replied, "I was just curious to know how long you'd keep up the act." As he spoke, Sage removed his shirt completely, revealing a perfect physique from his face to his lower abdomen, which was visible, that left Robert speechless. His face was flawless and alluring, but his body was breathtaking, making Robert swallow hard, unable to tear his eyes away from Sage's chest. "You can leave now that you're awake," Sage said, snapping Robert back to reality. Robert needed an excuse to stay longer, and without thinking, he blurted out, "Where's your dog?" Sage raised an eyebrow. "How did you know I have a dog?" Realizing his slip-up, Robert's mind raced to come up with a believable answer. But before he could say anything, Karina, Sage's dog, walked into the room. Grateful for the distraction, Robert quickly bent down, scooping Karina up and petting her, hoping to shift Sage's attention away from the question. He remembered what his ex-boyfriends had said about how much Sage adored Karina. If he could get the dog to like him, he thought, maybe Sage would let his guard down. Robert also loved dogs, and he didn't have to try hard to get Karina to like him because she did instantly. Sage, with a hint of surprise, remarked, "She never lets anyone but me carry her." Robert replied, "Maybe she's tired of having just one dad and wouldn't mind having two." Sage walked over and took Karina from Robert's arms. The closeness made Robert's knees weak, his heart racing, and he had to resist the urge to touch Sage's chest as he stood so close. Sage asked, "Aren't you leaving?" Robert sighed, giving a wave to Karina before reluctantly heading for the door. In the following days, Robert kept trying to get into Sage's mansion, but the security wouldn't let him in, and he kept missing Sage's comings and goings because his schedule wasn't as regular as Robert had been told. One night, Robert was out with Jasper, sitting in a cafe and chatting, when he spotted Sage walking by with Karina. Robert then noticed that the cafe was close to Sage's place. He quickly excused himself, telling Jasper they'd meet another day, and hurried after Sage, stopping him at his gate. Sage looked slightly surprised and asked, "What are you doing here? Are you stalking me now?" Robert quickly denied it, saying, "No, I just saw you pass by and I realized I miss Karina." At that moment, Karina jumped off Sage and onto Robert, refusing to return to Sage. Sage gave up trying to get her back and just stood watching as Robert played with her. Seeing an opportunity, Robert suggested, "It's too cold out for her, maybe we should go inside?" Without a word, Sage headed inside to his room, and Robert followed with Karina. While Sage worked on some contracts, Robert sat with Karina, his attention drifting to Sage, who looked even more attractive as he focused on his work. Robert stared at Sage, debating whether to reveal his ex-boyfriend's plan or not. He still hadn't thought of doing it and didn't know what to do. They called him every day, pressing for updates on how close he had gotten with Sage, and now he couldn't back out of what he had started. He thought that since Sage was more influential than all of them combined, maybe Sage could save him from facing imprisonment if he told him everything. But he also can't take a risk because Sage is unreadable and he can't predict how he would react if he tells him. Sage suddenly interrupted his thoughts, asking, "Is there something on my face?" Robert snapped back to reality, replying, "Huh?" Sage pointed to Karina, noting, "She's already asleep." Robert glanced down and realized she really was. It seemed like it was time for him to leave. Gently, he placed Karina in her bed and prepared to go, but his eyes caught sight of a piano he hadn't noticed before. Robert had loved playing the piano since childhood and used to sneak into school just to play because he didn't have one at home. Seeing the piano reminded him of his love for playing and was itching to play. He asked Sage if he could, and Sage just nodded. Robert went over to the piano and began playing a song that caught Sage's attention. When he finished, Sage asked, "How do you know that song?" Robert shrugged, "I don't remember." Sage then shared, "My parents used to play it for me when I was younger. I miss them now." Robert realized that he never saw Sage's parents. Both times he had been to the mansion, it was always just him and the house workers. He said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know your parents had passed." Sage replied, "What do you mean? My parents are very much alive, still enjoying their honeymoon after 50+ years of being together. They live in a different house because they want their space." Feeling embarrassed, Robert replied, "Oh, I didn't know that." Sage chuckled lightly, surprising him. When Robert noticed Sage checking his watch, he figured it was time for him to head home. It seemed Sage was now warming up to him a bit and wanted to take the chance. He faked feeling dizzy and flopped down on Sage's bed, expecting Sage to kick him out or tell him to leave. Robert was surprised when Sage did nothing and let him stay. What started as pretending soon turned into real sleep, and Robert dozed off. He woke up a while later and noticed Sage was still working, not in bed. Sneaking a glance at the time, Robert saw it was 3 a.m. Thinking Sage wouldn't send him home this late, he sat up and asked, "Why are you still awake?" Sage didn't respond, so Robert asked, "Is it because I'm sleeping in your bed?" Still, no reply. Robert tried again, "Is it because you can't sleep?" Sage gave a small nod. Robert climbed out of bed, walked over, and pulled Sage toward the bed, saying, "You should at least try to sleep, even if you can't." Sage went along with it, lying down without protest. Robert turned on a rain sound video and said, "I listen to this whenever I have trouble sleeping." Sage immediately turned it off, replying, "I can't sleep with even the tiniest sound." After thinking for a moment, Robert scooted closer to Sage and began softly stroking his hair. "Is this okay?" he asked. Sage didn't reply, just stared at Robert as they laid there, face to face. After a while, they both drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Sage woke up earlier to get ready for work. Robert had already woken up, but stayed in bed, pretending to sleep. Once Sage was dressed and ready to leave, he leaned over the bed, his face close to Robert's, and said, "Are you going to keep pretending?" Robert stretched and yawned, acting as if he had just woken up, as if he didn't know where he was. Sage smirked slightly and asked, "Do you want me to drop you off on my way to work, or you can leave on your own?" Robert quickly replied, asking Sage to drop him off. They both headed to the car, the ride filled with silence. Though Sage wasn't heading in the direction of Robert's house, he still dropped him off there. As Robert got out, the car pulled away before he had a chance to even say goodbye to Sage. As Robert walked toward his door, he saw Jasper. Jasper immediately approached him, concerned, and asked if he was okay. Robert reassured him, saying he was fine, then asked why Jasper was at his house, not that he minded. Jasper explained that he was worried after Robert had suddenly left the cafe, and then his phone became unreachable. Robert checked his phone and found several missed calls and texts from Jasper. He assured Jasper that nothing was wrong. His phone had just been on silent. Relieved, Jasper then asked, "Who was the person that just dropped you off?" Robert quickly brushed it off, saying, "It was nobody," and ushered Jasper into his house. The next day, Robert casually headed to Sage's place, not expecting to be let in, knowing the security would likely turn him away. However, to his surprise, the security guard not only allowed him in, but greeted him politely. Puzzled, Robert kept glancing back, wondering if they would realize their mistake, but they didn't. Once inside, he discovered Sage wasn't home. He found it odd that they'd let him in when Sage wasn't even there. Feeling a bit bored, Robert wandered around the mansion until Karina excitedly ran up to him. As he stroked her fur, he couldn't help but wonder how Sage managed to live alone in such a large place without ever feeling lonely or bored. Robert waited for a while, and soon, Sage came home, looking tired. Without a word, Sage headed straight to his room, and Robert followed, watching as Sage opened a drawer filled with various pills. Startled by the amount, Robert stopped him before he could take any and asked, "What are they for?" Sage just pointed to his head, indicating he had a headache. Robert made him put the pills down and guided him to the bed, sitting him down. He then began massaging Sage's temples and the center of his forehead. Sage rested his head on Robert's tummy as he did so, feeling relaxed, and fell asleep before knowing. When Robert noticed Sage had fallen asleep, he silently laid him down on the bed and covered him with the blanket. Sitting beside him, Robert found himself staring at Sage, lost in thought. Why did all those spoiled, wealthy young men hate him so much? So far, Sage had been nothing but a nice person. All the others he dated were rude to everyone they thought was below them, childish, and always complaining about everything. But Sage was different. He was nice to his workers, mature, and works hard, unlike the others that just spend their parents' money without working. Robert couldn't bring himself to do to Sage what his ex-boyfriends wanted. While deep in thought, Robert's phone rang. It was the very people he had just been thinking about, checking in on his progress. Robert was tired of them and wanted to finally tell them off, but he knew he wasn't ready to risk going to jail. Instead, he sighed and told them to relax, assuring them he was still working on it. As he whispered on the phone, Sage shifted in his sleep, and Robert immediately hung up. He glanced at Sage one last time before leaving. He didn't even get to really talk with Sage, but at least there was progress in their closeness. In the following days, Robert began going in and out of Sage's mansion as if he lived there, now that security allowed him free access. He spent time playing with Karina, occasionally played the piano, but his main goal was Sage. Sage didn't talk much, only spoke a few words when he had to. Robert just did all the talking every time, and Sage seemed to like listening to him talk, slightly chuckling and grinning often. One day Sage asked Robert to teach him to play the piano. Robert, puzzled, asked, "You have a piano in your room, and you can't play?" Sage simply replied that he hadn't had the time to learn. Robert nodded, agreeing to teach him. Sage already knew how to play. He just enjoyed watching Robert's eyes light up whenever he played the piano. Later, Sage walked over to his drawer, took out a spare key to his house, and handed it to Robert. Robert looked at the key in confusion, asking, "What's this for?" Sage explained, "For whenever you want to come by, even though you probably won't need it since the workers are always here, but I just felt like giving it to you." Still confused, Robert asked, "Do you give a key to everyone who comes to your house?" Sage shook his head. "No, just my parents, you, and my butler." Robert stared at Sage, puzzled. Had Sage already fallen for him? Was he that easy like the other ones he dated? Robert took the key and headed home. On his way home, Robert ran into Jasper. Jasper immediately remarked, "You've been hard to reach lately." Robert stayed silent, knowing that was true. He had been so wrapped up in Sage that he'd forgotten about his first love. Walking side by side, they made their way to Robert's house to talk. Jasper asked what Robert had been up to recently, to which Robert replied, "Nothing important." Then Robert asked Jasper the same question, and Jasper responded, "Thinking about you." Unlike before, Robert didn't feel the excitement he usually felt when Jasper said things like that. He brushed it off, thinking that maybe he was just stressed. Jasper blurted out he couldn't wait any longer and that every day felt like Robert was slipping further away from him. He confessed his feelings and asked Robert to be his boyfriend. The sudden confession caught Robert off guard. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. This should have been the moment he'd always wanted, to finally be with his first love, but something held him back. He gave himself an excuse that it was because he needed to finish things with Sage first before he could fully focus on Jasper. Robert asked Jasper to give him some time, and he would give him an answer then. Jasper, though disappointed, replied, "Take all the time you need, but not too long." Robert nodded, promising to give Jasper an answer when he was ready. Robert began his piano lessons with Sage, finding himself squeezed onto a single stool with Sage, their legs and arms pressed close together. Their fingers often brushed against each other, as Robert taught Sage. Despite his suspicion that Sage might already know how to play, Robert couldn't figure out why Sage would pretend otherwise. Robert often caught Sage's gaze from the corner of his eye. Sage always focused on Robert's face instead of focusing on the lesson. Even though they both squeezed on the stool, Robert wasn't uncomfortable at all and enjoyed every lesson with Sage, not wanting them to end. One day, as Robert was about to leave Sage's mansion, Sage stopped him and handed him a black card. Robert was taken aback. It wasn't that he had never seen or been given a black card before, but this was sudden. First a key to the mansion and now a black card? What is this? Why are you suddenly giving me this? Robert asked, confused. Sage replied, "Do you not like it?" Robert was tempted, but he felt a deep sense of guilt and didn't think it was right to accept it. If his interest in Sage had been purely for financial gain, he might have taken it without hesitation. Robert handed the card back to Sage. "I don't think I should take this," he said, before quickly leaving. Sage watched Robert leave, feeling confused. He knew who Robert was, the guy who only dated wealthy young men for financial gain. Almost all the young men in their circle now knew him. Sage had originally let Robert get close to him out of curiosity, wanting to know the kind of person he really was, and to see if Robert approached him with the same motive. But now, that curiosity is turning into something else. Sage found himself enjoying Robert's company more than he expected. Despite knowing Robert's reputation, Sage wasn't trying to rid himself of the feelings growing inside him. The only reason Sage could think Robert had approached him too was for financial gain, but now he wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just a tactic. In the following days, he bought expensive gifts for Robert, but Robert refused them all. Robert was confused as to why Sage keeps giving him stuff, and Sage was confused as to why Robert keeps rejecting his gifts. Isn't that the reason why he approached him in the first place? Or did he have a different motive? At home, Jasper was finally ready for his answer. He couldn't wait any longer, but Robert wasn't prepared to give it. Deep down, he knew his feelings for Jasper were long gone, and what he thought was love had faded. All he could see when he tried to figure his feelings out was Sage. Jasper could already read the answer on Robert's face, so he quickly said, "You know what? Take all the time you need to think about it," and hurried away, not ready to hear the truth. He wasn't ready to let go. Sage received a call from his parents, saying they missed him and wanted him to visit for a few days. He already knew their true motive. They wanted to pester him about marriage and wanting a grandchild. Even so, he had to go, knowing they wouldn't stop until he did, and truthfully, he missed them too. To avoid the usual nagging, he decided to take Robert along and introduce him as his boyfriend, hoping it would keep them quiet during his visit. When Robert came over, Sage asked, "Will you be my boyfriend?" Robert choked on his saliva, coughing, and Sage quickly grabbed him some water. After calming down, Robert asked, "What did you just say?" Sage clarified, "Oh, I meant, will you pretend to be my boyfriend to meet my parents? I'm spending a few days with them, and I want you to come as my fake boyfriend." Robert, still surprised, replied, "Oh, sure, I can do that." He was taken aback by Sage's request. None of the other influential guys he had dated ever dared to let their parents know they liked men, let alone introduce him, even though their parents always found out. Robert grew curious about how Sage's parents would react. On the day of the trip, Sage picked Robert up from his place. Sage's parents' mansion was twice the size of Sage's home, and for the first time, Robert felt nervous about meeting parents. As they approached the entrance, Sage took his hand, leading him inside. As soon as Sage saw his parents, his whole demeanor shifted. He suddenly resembled a little kid being picked up from kindergarten, grinning from ear to ear as he hugged them tightly. They glanced at Robert, and Sage introduced him as his boyfriend. His parents gave him a skeptical look, asking, "Your boyfriend? Really?" Sage nodded, "Yes. Is there a problem?" His mom, still curious, asked, "Who made the first move?" Sage raised his hand, "I did." His mom chuckled, "You? I never thought this day would come. I was thinking I'd have to choose a partner for you. You can't even ask a bird out on a date. I didn't know you had it in you. I guess I can stop worrying now." Sage's parents pulled Robert to sit with them, and Robert braced himself for the usual grilling, expecting to hear warnings like "Stay away from my son" or questions about his family background. But none of that came. Instead, Sage's parents were funny, easygoing, and already seemed to love him. It became clear to Robert where Sage got his kindness and calm nature. The only difference between them was that Sage was more of a listener, while his parents were quite talkative. After a while, Sage pulled Robert away from their endless chatter and took him to the room prepared for him. Since they were now boyfriends, they had to share the same room and bed, not that it was their first time sleeping in the same bed. Once they were alone, Sage admitted, "I know my parents probably don't believe we're actually dating. We'll have to act like we're crazy about each other, just like they do for them to buy it." He then asked, "Do I have permission to hold your hand whenever I find them suspecting?" Robert replied, "Just holding hands? Why not kissing? That's more believable." Sage quipped, "Do you do this fake dating thing a lot?" Robert, caught off guard, quickly responded, No, I've never. This is my first time." Sage nodded, "Okay." During the following days at Sage's parents' house, his parents kept giving them suspicious looks. To keep up the act, Sage and Robert held hands, fed each other at breakfast and dinner, and acted like a couple deeply in love. One day, while his parents were still watching them with suspicion, Sage whispered to Robert, "I'm going to kiss you," then leaned in. Robert's heart raced, and he closed his eyes, leaning in as well, expecting a kiss on the lips. Instead, He felt Sage's lips gently press against his forehead. Surprised, Robert opened his eyes and mumbled, "That's it." That night, as they lay in bed, Robert was almost drifting off to sleep, but Sage lay beside him, wide awake. Robert could sense it, even with his eyes closed. He turned toward Sage and asked, "Can't sleep?" Sage nodded silently. Sage scooted closer to Robert and started gently stroking his hair. With their faces now inches apart, Sage felt a pull and leaned in slowly. Robert, noticing the movement, quietly remarked, "Your parents aren't watching us now." Sage froze for a second, then slowly moved back, apologizing, "I'm sorry." But before he could pull away completely, Robert gently caught him by the neck and pulled him into a kiss, pressing his lips against Sage's. For a moment, Sage was taken by surprise, but then he kissed back, slightly parting his lips as Robert deepened the kiss. Robert's hand ran through Sage's hair, slightly pulling it, while Sage lost himself in the moment, no longer thinking about anything but the kiss. They pressed closer, their bodies moving until there was no space between them, their legs intertwined. Finally, they broke apart, gasping for air, their eyes locked on each other. Sage looked into Robert's eyes and asked, "Does this kiss mean anything to you, or is it just casual?" Robert then asked back, "Does it mean anything to you?" Sage nodded. "I wouldn't kiss someone I'm not in love with." Robert's heart skipped a beat as he asked, "So, you're in love with me?" Sage nodded again. "Do you feel the same?" Without thinking, Robert nodded, but quickly shook his head, saying, "You can't fall in love with me. You deserve someone better than me." Sage looked at him, unfazed. "I don't want anyone else. I don't care why you approached me, whatever the reason was. I'm willing to provide anything for you, to give you all the luxuries and comforts you desire, and to do whatever I can for you. As long as you feel the same way, and I'm the only one in your heart and eyes, that's all that matters to me." Sage wanted to give Robert everything, to be enough for him, so that Robert wouldn't need to date other men for money anymore. Sage didn't care about Robert's reputation at all. Robert sat up, confused. "You knew that I used to date men for their money?" Sage nodded, and Robert continued, "And you're still in love with me? Why?" Sage replied softly, "I don't care about your past. I'm not here to judge you. As long as you're not doing it anymore, at least with other people, you can use me instead." Robert shook his head. "I don't want to be with you for any material gain. I don't live that life anymore. I just want to love and be loved genuinely." Sage's eyes softened as he asked, "So, you love me too?" Robert hesitated, then slowly nodded. Sage smiled. "Should we turn this fake dating into a real thing?" Robert wanted to say yes, but he couldn't shake the guilt of how he had first approached Sage. It wasn't pure, and he didn't want their relationship to start with a lie. He looked at Sage and said, "Can we put that on hold for now?" Sage asked why. Robert didn't know how to explain it, so instead, he leaned in and gently kissed Sage on the lips. "I promise to give you a positive answer later. Just give me some time." The kiss did it for Sage. He asked no more questions and was ready to wait until Robert was ready. On the last day of their stay at Sage's parents' house, Sage and Robert attended a birthday party hosted by one of Sage's father's business partners. These types of events were primarily networking opportunities for wealthy business people, and Robert wasn't thrilled about going. He knew those guys would be there, the ones whose calls he had been avoiding lately. Despite his reluctance, he couldn't say no to Sage. At the party, just as Robert had predicted, they were present. He could feel their eyes on him as he sat with Sage and his parents. Finally, fed up, Robert excused himself to go to the washroom. The guys followed him, cornering him the moment he was alone. They confronted him, asking why it was taking so long for him to complete his task and why he had been avoiding them lately. They reminded Robert that time was running out for him to obtain the tape of Sage, hinting that they hadn't forgotten their threats of sending him to prison. At the time Robert stood up to leave for the washroom, Sage had noticed the guys following him, and concerned, decided to follow as well. He heard their entire conversation, and now knew the main reason why Robert had approached him. As the group left the washroom, Sage hid behind a corner, not wanting them to see him. One of the men, Collins, lingered behind. When it was just him and Robert, Collins asked, "Are you falling in love with Sage?" Robert, irritated, replied, "What's it to you if I am?" Collins retorted, even though you betrayed me and we're not together anymore, I still have feelings for you. I can accept you liking anyone else, but not Sage." Robert scoffed. "I don't need your permission to like anyone," then deliberately bumped his shoulder into Collins as he walked past. As Robert left, Collins called after him, "I'm watching you." Sage managed to get back to his seat before Robert returned from the washroom. The drive back to drop Robert off at his house was quiet, and as they pulled up, Sage hesitated for a moment before asking, "Do you have anything to tell me?" Robert paused, thinking through everything. After a moment of contemplation, he shook his head. "No, I don't." Sage simply nodded, "Good night," before driving off. Robert wondered what Sage meant. Back at his apartment, Robert's mind drifted to Jasper. They hadn't spoken or seen each other since the night, and Robert knew he had to give him an answer, something clear and final. Knowing Jasper wouldn't come to see him, Robert decided to go to the one place he knew Jasper would be, the park Jasper frequented every night. Sure enough, Robert found him there. As soon as Robert mentioned having something important to say, Jasper tried to deflect, talking about anything else. But Robert wasn't going to let it slide this time. He told Jasper, "I can't reciprocate your feelings. I can't date you." Jasper, though disappointed, had already anticipated this day. He had to accept it and asked if they could still be friends. Of course, Robert replied without hesitation, pulling Jasper into a hug. Meanwhile, back in his own home, Sage couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had overheard between Robert and the other guys. Despite everything, his feelings for Robert hadn't wavered. He trusted that Robert wouldn't give in to their demands. Sage just wished Robert would open up to him about it. He knew handling those guys wouldn't be difficult, but for now, all he wanted was for Robert to trust him enough to tell him the truth. After work the next day, Sage found himself heading to Robert's house instead of going home. When Robert opened the door, he was surprised to see Sage standing there. Robert noticed Sage didn't look well and immediately asked, "Are you okay?" Sage gently pulled him into a hug, tightening his arms around him. He shook his head and said, "I just wanted to see you." Robert smiled, wrapping his arms around Sage and said, "I was actually about to head to your place." They hugged for almost a minute before Sage gently pulled away, cupping Robert's face in his hands. He gazed into his eyes and said, "You know you can tell me anything." Robert nodded, confused as to why Sage was suddenly saying that. For the next few days, Sage continued to ask Robert if he had anything to tell him, and each time, Robert gave the same response, no. One night, after leaving Sage's place, Robert was caught in a heavy downpour before he could get very far. He decided to turn back, realizing he wasn't far from Sage's place and he was already getting soaked. By the time he reached Sage's house, his clothes were drenched. He went up to Sage's room to get a change of clothes. When Robert entered the room, he was greeted by the sight of Sage standing there, fresh out of the shower. He was wearing nothing but sweatpants, his chest bare, with water droplets still clinging to his skin. His wet hair hung messily around his face as he patted it with a towel. Sage looked up, surprised to see Robert back again. "Why are you back?" Sage asked, but then noticed Robert's soaked clothes. Sage hadn't realized it was raining. Robert was mesmerized by Sage at that point and couldn't hear any word he said. Sage was worried Robert might catch a cold and turned to get a dryer to dry his hair and also a change of clothes. As Sage turned, Robert reached out and grabbed his hand. Stopping him, Sage turned and asked what was wrong. Robert moved closer and kissed him on the lips. Sage pulled back, staring at Robert, confused by the sudden kiss. In a low voice, Robert asked, "Do you want to have sex?" Sage looked at him, emotions swirling. He ran his hand through Robert's wet hair, then gently caressed his cheeks. Smiling lightly, Sage leaned in and kissed Robert again. The kiss started softly, but grew more intense with each passing second. They briefly broke the kiss to remove Robert's wet shirt, then continued, moving toward the bed. They left trails of kisses on each other as they undressed, Sage trusting Robert completely. He knew Robert's love was real. He felt it in his touch, his kisses, and the way he looks at him. As raindrops pattered against the windows, their soft moans blended with the sound. The passionate night ended with their bodies entwined. Robert didn't want to hold back anymore. He decided to end the deal with the guys and tell Sage everything, unsure of how they'd react in person. He called them to say the deal was off. Afterward, Robert asked Sage on a date, planning to come clean and ask him to be his partner officially. It would be their first real date. He made a reservation at a luxury restaurant and took Sage there. What Robert didn't know was that the restaurant belonged to Collins's family, and unfortunately Collins was there when they walked in. The moment Robert saw him, he wanted to turn around, but Collins had already spotted them and approached. With a smirk, he asked, "Are you two dating?" Robert didn't answer and tried to leave with Sage, but Collins blocked their path and turned to Sage. "Do you know your boyfriend is only with you to get a sex tape for us? He doesn't really love you." Sage didn't react, already aware of what Collins was talking about. Wanting some kind of reaction, Collins pulled out his phone and sent something to Sage. "You might want to see this too." Sage opened the message and saw intimate pictures of Robert with another guy, Jasper. In some of the photos, they were even kissing. Sage turned to Robert, his face filled with hurt and disappointment. He could have accepted anything, but this was too much. He thought Robert had changed, but it seems he hadn't. Robert didn't know exactly what Collins had sent, but he figured it was related to the sex tape. Seeing Sage's expression, he immediately started apologizing, begging for a chance to explain. Sage walked out, and when Robert tried to follow, he asked him not to. Sage went home alone, while Robert headed to his place, not even feeling like confronting Collins. He broke down in tears the moment he got home. Meanwhile, Sage lay in bed, his mind racing. It was 1 a.m. and he couldn't sleep. Frustrated, he got up and drove himself to Robert's house. He sat in his car, debating whether to go knock or not, also knowing it was late and Robert was likely asleep. Just as he was about to leave, he saw the lights in Robert's house come on. Robert casually glanced out the window and noticed Sage's car parked outside. He immediately stepped out, and Sage got out of his car to approach him. Sage saw that Robert's eyes were red and his face was wet from tears. He wanted to reach out and touch his face, but hesitated. Robert started to explain himself, but Sage stopped him, saying he wasn't upset about that and had already known, just waiting for Robert to tell him. Sage showed him the pictures Collins had sent. Robert recognized himself and Jasper in the images, but most were photoshopped. He explained that he and Jasper were just friends and that the photos were manipulated. He had never kissed Jasper. Sage nodded. He thought so too, after calming down and thinking. Sage pulled Robert into a hug and said, "I believe you. I'm sorry for walking away before." Robert pulled away from the hug, saying he was the one who needed to apologize. He had wanted to tell Sage everything on their date before Collins interrupted. Sage told him that it didn't matter anymore. Robert then said, "I was also going to ask you to be my boyfriend." Sage's eyes lit up. Robert continued, "I wanted to make it a special night, but it's ruined now." Sage cupped Robert's face and gave him a quick kiss on the lips. "Every day with you is special to me," Robert asked. "So can I ask now?" Sage replied, "You don't have to ask. My heart belonged to you the moment I realized I was in love with you." Robert smiled and asked, "Will you accept me as your lifetime partner? Someone to spend every day of your life with, someone who'll be by your side at every step, your best friend and the love of your life?" Sage replied, "I do." They both chuckled and embraced each other. Sage briefly broke the hug to kiss both of Robert's eyes, apologizing for making him cry, and then hugged him again. The guys couldn't do anything to Robert after he broke the deal because now he had Sage by his side. Even if they somehow managed to get him locked up, Sage would have him released in no time. Plus, Sage had warned them not to bother Robert again. Jasper was happy for Robert when he found out about his relationship with Sage. He wasn't really happy, but there was nothing he could do about it. Sage and Robert went on their first date, followed by many more after that.